Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be discussing the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. So the MacArthur Foundation is about global reach, and basically what that means is they want to reach a large global audience, so to speak. So what the MacArthur Foundation does is they work in a number of countries, including India, Mexico, and Nigeria, which sort of gives you a sense of kind of the global initiatives they want to try and fund. So Chicago is in there as well because Chicago is the MacArthur Foundation's headquarters, and that's where John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur are from. So they like to support a lot of initiatives, as a lot of foundations do, based around their headquarters. So the mission statement for the MacArthur Foundation is essentially that they want to partner with creative and influential institutions, which essentially means they're looking for novel solutions to sort of complex problems, and they want institutions that reflect their ability to have the kind of global reach that the MacArthur Foundation itself has. So a lot of what they want to fund are just, verdant, and peaceful projects and organizations, which essentially means just meaning they want it to be moral and rational, verdant meaning they want it to flourish, they want people to have positive benefits, and peaceful, they want to bring about peace instead of conflict or war. And so it's good to keep in mind that this is a liberal-minded organization. They like to work with a lot of initiatives that deal with equity. So a lot of equitable institutions they favor. So here I have some big bets. I have climate change, nuclear programs, corruption in Nigeria, local justice reform, and these are just basically things that they're looking at now. These are things where if an institution, a nonprofit, a sector of the government is looking to reduce global emissions, if they're trying to decrease nuclear proliferation, if they're working with local governments on prison reform, they want to be looking at those kinds of programs and initiatives. That's where they're putting their focus on now. So those are the big bets they're looking at. So moving forward, some of the good math. So eligibility, the kind of organizations that are going to be eligible or organizations with a, like I said before, national or global reach. They do work with organizations that are more regional, and those are going to be organizations in what's called their continuing initiatives, which is things they funded in the past, they still want to fund in the future. So that's media and journalism, alongside investments in Chicago is where they like to put a lot of their investments for their continuing growth, alongside their big bets that I mentioned in the previous slide. So they want to have long-term strategies. Most of the projects they fund are about 2 to 3 years. They want to have an impact. They want to use their money in an impactful way. They want to strategically address complicated societal issues, which might mean, like I said before, prison reform, or maybe more specifically, they want to look at how transgender communities or maybe Hispanic communities specifically are influenced by law enforcement, stop and frisk. In New York was a policy that overwhelmingly targeted African American minorities. So those are the kind of things I want to look at, and that goes into this later notion of working with marginalized communities or communities that make justice a focal point. And an example here is the Equal Justice Initiative, which works on criminal justice reform and racial justice. And so an example of an award that they've been given is to aid in efforts against the detention of juveniles for life without parole. As a quick side note, all the organizations I mentioned here are on their website. I want to give you concrete examples so you can go back and see the awards and a little more in depth of what the MacArthur Foundation funds. So I want to give you concrete examples that you can return to and see more in depth. These are just a few examples that fit some of the good match criteria. In the eligibility, I also mentioned research. I'll get more into that in the problem-solving section. But that basically means that, like Koch mentions in in her text. I believe it's on pages 68 and 69. A lot of these groups are foundations have experts and expertise. So when you're writing perhaps MacArthur Foundation, you want to keep in mind that you want to use some somewhat expert terminology. If you're doing prison reform, to go back to that example, you might say, terminology that fits into that. So that's just something to keep in mind. Geography, like I said, they like global initiatives. I mentioned Client Earth here is another one. They assist nonprofits on issues related to the environment, and they have offices in Brussels, Warsaw, Beijing. Just to give an example of the kind of initiatives they want to fund that have that kind of global reach that they're looking for to sort of further their money. So the example of the award here is they're helping governments in China, non-government agencies, in China fight climate change. China is a big pollutant. They're big industrial nations. They want to sort of curb down on those emissions. So that's one example for geography. As I mentioned before, where they're headquartered in Chicago, they like to fund a lot of programs in their hometown. So Better Chicago is one that basically just supports schools in the city of Chicago, helps them. It could be teacher training, it could be student tutoring, just basic services to help the community. And so the example here for the award is public school stakeholders. They want to bring equity into schools. A lot of these big cities are segregated. And so maybe one of the initiatives, as in this example, is to sort of work around some of that segregation. As far as the subject matter is concerned, there are a couple of big bets: climate change, nuclear programs, corruption in Nigeria, local justice reform. These are just, as I said before, big ticket ideas that they want to fund, where their priorities are currently. They believe that their investments are best suited here. So if you want to write a proposal, these are the areas that you want to write towards. And then the continued commitments, of course, in journalism and media, and the city of Chicago. But you can go on their website and see more in depth a lot of what these sort of mean. And I'll give some examples closer to the end. So a good example of a subject matter one is Chatham House. And Chatham House works to help create policies that can curb nuclear proliferation, basically meaning countries that can get nuclear arms. So that's just an example of an organization that works in the nuclear sector for one of their big bets. And that award was given to assist in novel or new technologies that could analyze methods to keep countries from getting nuclear weapons, essentially. So requests for proposals, as Cook mentions on page 35, just because an organization foundation isn't taking proposals doesn't mean you can't do a letter of inquiry. So in climate change, nuclear challenge, and local justice reform, they're not taking unsolicited proposals. But if you have an idea that fits into one of those topics, then you might want to go ahead and send a letter of inquiry to them. The ones that are accepting proposals are corruption in Nigeria, journalism and media, and investments in Chicago. And I'll get a little more to that in the next slide. So some examples of ones that aren't taking unsolicited proposals are climate change, where they're working on building sustainable coalitions between the US, India, and China. Big industrial nations that have high levels of emissions. They're trying to curb that down. And so proposed solution that you may offer, that may be looking to solve in some way, is cutting down on carbon emission, taxing carbon emissions, reducing methane emissions, and funding renewable energy. And nuclear challenges, so they'd be funding any projects that are looking to decrease, who can get nuclear warheads, for example. Or if you're trying to get uranium, that's something they also want to decrease, or general systems at large that sort of, like the UN would have a subcommittee that might oversee nuclear proliferation. So you might want to write something on a UN project, might be a good example. Those accepting proposals, an example is corruption in Nigeria. That works mainly with the media and journalism. And basically, they're just trying to get a transparency for the Nigerian government. They see it as being overly corrupt. It's one of the most populous nations in Africa, so it's a good place to start for helping other nations down the road have more transparent government. So you might do something within that field or sector for a project for corruption in Nigeria. The size of grants, it depends on the project. It can range from $30,000 to $1 million. A good example is the American Bar Association's Fund for Justice and Education. Basically, they just work with people in law, and they gave an award, in this instance, $37,000 to update an assessment document about undocumented children, how best to offer them legal care and advice. That's pretty basic, just basic research to update previous research. But something larger, like the National Conference of Legislators, it's across the country, so they need more funding. And basically, they want to help state legislators do better with policy and practice research around local justice reform. For problem solving, as I said, MacArthur Foundation likes to do research, but they're more focused on research for policy proposals. So if you go back in this presentation and you sort of take more of a look at some of the awards, or if you take a look at what some of the organizations they fund do, it's a lot of research intended for policy purposes. They want to do research to eventually influence policy to make a practical decision later down the road. So that's just something to keep in mind. A good example is Just Leadership USA, which basically works on prison reform by having previously incarcerated inmates come in and talk about their experiences and what could be done further down the road to fix the prison system. And so this award, for example, is to disseminate information about ways to have more successful justice reform measures and have the inmates sort of give their input on those measures. So recently funded projects for nuclear challenges, for instance, the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center, they were given $240,000 to create and send out information on how to prevent U.S. allies from acquiring nuclear weapons. It's not just about enemies, it's just about keeping sort of the world at large out of that kind of nuclear crisis, so to speak. So it had listed the outcome on the website to create policy responses capable of reducing nuclear armament, or people who get nuclear warheads or uranium, for instance, such as in Iran and North Korea. Be good examples. For climate change, one of the recently funded projects, the Partnership for Southern Equity, works with low-income communities in the South to give them advocacy to help politicians and policymakers make better decisions about the environment in terms of their local communities. And so the award given to them was to help those community-based organizations that speak on behalf of those smaller communities advocate for climate change initiatives. So likely future projects would be, they help a large number of individuals. As I said earlier, they take on a significant issue like prison reform or climate change is in their big bets. They influence policy in some way, so policymakers will read this and they'll consider new initiatives down the road that implement those policies in practical ways. And they take an ambitious stance. So you're dealing with national and international organizations, so you want them to be ambitious, you want the projects to be meaningful and influential. So just a few quick examples might be research on policies to fix income equality and affordable housing in the wake of the coronavirus, which is a big issue in terms of evictions, for example. People can't pay the rent because they're not working. Research on policy issues to fix scarcity in the healthcare system. People can't get masks and ventilators, for instance. Or research on policies to fix issues related to militarization or police misconduct or police abuse of force, as we're sort of seeing now in the wake of George Floyd. Do we fund the police? Where does the money go? How much money should the police get? So these are just a couple examples of things that are important now. They're significant. Policy can be made to fix these solutions. They can help a lot of people. So these are just a couple examples of projects that could be funded by the MacArthur Foundation down the road. And this is my bibliography. It's a little short. Like I said, you can look on pages 68 and 69 and page 35 just to see what foundations are looking for. And like I said, everything you can find is on the MacArthur Foundation website. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. I hope it's informative.